occupies or belongs to Brazil, the 60% of that. So as you can imagine, the Amazon is very important, but not only for Brazil. The Amazon is also very important for all of us in Germany, in Ecuador overall, because the Amazonia is in charge of taking control or regulating also the planetary health due to its pivotal role in Earth's climate. This is why, from a broader perspective, we consider that protecting the ecosystem is very important. But also there are many other issues when we encounter, we were doing the research. There is problem of deforestation, there is a problem of agriculture, massive agriculture, and also criminal threats for communities, indigenous communities. From all of these problems, we decided to focus on two problems. The first one is deforestation, because as you know, in the last 2 years, this has been a huge problem. And just to consider this year, in the first semester of 2022, the gas emissions increased in 20%. And it is very unlikely that Brazil is going to reach the global goals that they have for the agenda of 2030. But unfortunately, the Amazonia is not the only problem, and is not the only one that is having issues. We need to also consider Sao Paulo. And in Sao Paulo, we have also problems regarding climate action. They have a different nature in Sao Paulo. According to our research, the impact of cities is even worse than the impact that is happening in the Amazon. We cannot forget that Sao Paulo plays a crucial role for several reasons. Sao Paulo is not only the most populous city in Brazil, but also in the whole Latin America. And is the fourth biggest city in the whole world. So as you can imagine, there are also in Sao Paulo many different realities. We need to consider also that Sao Paulo is the industrial hub of Brazil. And also they have the biggest, or Sao Paulo has the biggest automotive or pollution problems. So far, we have seen that in the bright side, Sao Paulo is also the city which has the most relevant or the most compliant plan regarding the SDGs. Actually, they have a report for the SDGs, and in 2021, they reported that in the case of smart mobility, they are doing huge progress, which is very good. However, climate action is not only fight with smart mobility. We need to think of sustainable cities, and this concept encompasses many other factors. Then we need to think about sustainable growth, sustainable citizens, and sustainable ecosystems. This is why we decided that in Sao Paulo, we need to consider how citizens are consuming, how products are produced in the land and also in the city. And this is why we decided to have a use case. We are focusing in see how is the product value change, the products that are originated in the Amazon or also in the state of Sao Paulo, because they have also agriculture here. And we'd like to connect the points. We would like to create trust, traceability, and all of these topics are going to be reflected today and tomorrow in our 5 panels. And I wish you to enjoy the upcoming discussions, and thank you very much for being here.
Okay, so now we are moving to the panel number 2, because we already did the panel number 1. So we kindly invite the panelists in panel 2 to come here to join us. Juliana, Professor Pfeiffer, Juan David, Felipe, and Nicolo. You start now.
Yes. Maybe we can close this.
Yeah, and you know, okay.
El panel está dividido en 2 partes. No, siéntense aquí, todos se tienen que sentar. Usted también. Nicolás, here. You can. So we would like to start with panel 2, which is very interesting and very dear to me because it relates to the regulation of data economy in Brazil and also how to promote data sharing. The title of the panel is The Data-Related Framework for Addressing Climate Change in Brazil, What is in Place and What is Missing. The objective of this panel is twofold. First, we would like to assess the evolving legal framework on data-related aspects, and second, we would like to discuss to what extent data markets can be more competitive, and at the same time, we could foster climate action. To do so, the panel will present the current Brazilian legal framework concerning data, and specifically data access and sharing. As discussed today morning, data sharing has the potential to foster innovation, and hence could be used for the creation of more efficient and sustainable products and markets. I would like to welcome to our first two panelists, because our panel is going to be divided in two parts. First, we are going to address data-related regulation, and afterwards, my colleague Herman is going to present the competition law part. We would like to start with Juliana Brucio. She is a professor of the doctoral program at Mackenzie Law School. She teaches digital law, and Juliana is already a professor since already 20 years at Mackenzie. Her course is very sought by students, and Juliana is also a very knowledgeable and respected lawyer in the area of data protection. Welcome, Juliana.
Thank you, Carolina. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mackenzie again. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor Vicente, and congratulations for the conference. Professor Drexel, thank you for being here with your group, and congratulations for this program. I ask as excuse, I will read in English my speaking, that is about Brazil's open data program in personal data. Brazil has started an open data program to keep up with the modernization of government while expanding the access to information and transparency. The initiative happened largely due to increasing social pressure for more participation in the public sphere, a movement which started at the beginning of the 21st century. The government's open data program began with the Access to Information Act, number 12527. The act, which provides that information of public interest must be made available by public agencies regardless of being requested. The information may be recorded in open, machine understandable, and non-proprietary formats. In 2011, Brazil also signed a partnership with the Open Government Partnership, which requires member countries to implement actions that promote transparency, participation, accountability, innovation, and the use of technology. The Open Data Program also determines that every 2 years, countries must develop and implement action plans. In 2012, Brazil created the National Open Data Infrastructure to promote the disclosure of data by the federal government. These included determining procedures and technologies to be implemented. It also created the Brazilian portal of open data, which includes databases of several public agents from different areas. In 2016, Decree number 8777 instituted the executive branch's open data policy. It established data disclosure as a general rule and secrecy as an exception. It guaranteed unrestricted access and use of data to be disclosed fully and up to date in an open format. The Brazilian General Data Protection Act, known as LGPD, from 2018 regulated personal data, both in the public and private spheres. Data protection created new obstacles that force organizations to sharing data. As a consequence, challenges regarding the openness of data began to emerge. Even though the open data initiatives were, 2019 brought new challenges concerning the federal government's commitment to disclosure data, and some regulations were developed to slow down its availability. For instance, Decree 9690 increased the number of public officials that could classify information as confidential. Even though the open data initiatives were weakened, the Ministry of Environment published its Open Data Plan in 2020. Its general objective was to promote the data disclosure from the Ministry of Environment to improve the mechanisms of publicity, transparency, and efficiency. The Ministry of Environment works together with the Digital Governance Committee, which has the assignment of promoting integration between organizational strategies and information and communications technology. Strategies to be met within the Ministry of Environment, as well as defining priorities in the formulation and execution of plans, projects, and investments in ICT for the Ministry of Environment. Furthermore, there is the Information Technology Master Plan, which is a diagnostic, planning, and management instrument for information technology, resources, and processes, with a view to guiding the meeting of the technological and information needs of the Ministry of Environment. The use of ICT in government is intended to strengthen in its relationship with society. Brazil has adopted the use of open government, which gained strength in the early 2000s and aims to establish governance as a way of managing government. With the open data policy, society starts to act as a partner of the state. But for this partnership to be effective and truly democratic, it's vital for ICTs to be combined with state actions, enabling society to participate in political activity, exercise its role of supervising the state and its actions, especially in the area of public policies. The vision of open government comes from the political need to recover the belief in the state and in government, and the basis for reestablishing the population's trust in the state is its transparency before society. In order for this transparency to occur, the disclosure of data becomes a tool for access to information and the consequent demand from society for the implementation of necessary public policies. Through the available data, it is possible, for example, to map areas where there is greater deforestation, of areas of soil contamination, and based on this data, public policies can be developed and applied to generate improvements. An important point of the disclosure of data in the public administration is the need to implement change not only in the areas involving technology itself, but change in the public administration to be implemented. Open data also leads to realizing the need for culture change by those who are part of the public administration, aligned with the use of these technologies, which involves change in process routines legal and behavioral changes, aiming at greater effectiveness, efficiency, and effectiveness when providing public service to citizens. Decree 10046 and data sharing. This decree addresses the sharing of personal data among federal agencies. The President of Brazil set the goal of creating the citizen-based register with the intention of gathering existing information on citizens from different agencies of the federal public administration. The decree also created the Central Data Governance Committee, which would be responsible for defining which databases would integrate into the base register. The Brazilian Bar Association filed an action for judicial review, claiming that the decree directly violates the Brazilian federal constitution. These ensure respectively that the violation is about the dignity of the individual, the inviolability of privacy, intimacy, and the private life, honor, and image of people, data confidentiality, the guarantee of habeas data, or habeas data, the protection of personal data, and informational self-determination. The Bar Association, as the plaintiff, argued that the fundamental right to data protection recognized by the Supreme Court was being violated, with the state claiming that the decree would facilitate the access of Brazilians to the federal public service. According to the plaintiff, the provisions discussed created a true tool of state surveillance by granting access to personal, family, and professional information, as well as sensitive data such as biometrics. The Bar Association also affirmed that there would be material unconstitutionality of the presidential decree, as it affected the fundamental rights of citizens. The Bar Association goes on to state that the decree's intention is to regulate the LGPD. And under Article 26 of the LGPD, the shared use of personal data by the government must meet specific purposes of public policy implementation and legal attribution by public agents and entities, while respecting the principles of personal data protection. However, the original text of the decree contains provisions that allow government agents to interconnect and cross-reference personal databases criteria that are not disclosed to the citizens, without clear, adequate, and transparent information about the collection and processing, as well as about who the agents of the processing are and how they operate. This adds opacity from a legal certainty perspective. Decree 10046 from 2019 does not enable an analysis of the context for how information is used, the hypothesis provided for sharing data, the purpose of its use, the risks to which citizens are exposed, and the legitimacy of activities involving the processing of personal data. The Brazilian Supreme Court recently, about 2 months ago, heard the case, ruling that the sharing of personal data among public administration bodies and entities presupposes the need for legitimate, specific, and explicit purposes for data processing. In other words, the federal government must comply with the LGPD when sharing data. Supreme Court Justice Gilmar Mendes was the reporter of the case. When stated his opinion, the justice asserted that there must be a balance between the public interest and the citizen's right to its protection. In his words, there is a clear need to reconcile the constitutional values of efficiency of the public administration with the constitutional regime of protection of individuals' rights, particularly the guarantees of information, self-determination, and protection of data, of personal data. To solve the decreased conflict with the federal constitution, the justice also affirms that a hybrid regime should be imposed for the treatment of the information collected or produced by the public administration, depending on the connection it has with personal attributes of the citizen. Processing of personal data by public agencies that is contrary to legal and constitutional parameters will lead to civil liability of the state for damages suffered by individuals. The state has rights of recourse against the public servants and political agents responsible for the unlawful act in case of negligence of willful intent. The willful transgression of the duty of publicity established by the LGPD outside the constitutional assumptions of secrecy will lead to the liability of the state agent for an act of administrative misconduct without prejudice to the application of disciplinary sanctions provided for in the statutes of federal, municipal, and states public servants. Unlike the EU, Brazil still has no regulation of the use and sharing of non-personal data. The EU Regulation 1807, which deals with the free movement of non-personal data within EU countries, aims to reduce technical and legal obstacles. It also prohibits EU states from establishing restriction of determining data allocation requirements, except in cases of public securities. But in Brazil, as I mentioned, there is no regulation such Regulation 1807. In Brazil, the LGPD, on the other hand, provides for data porting, but only for personal data. The right to porting gives the holders of personal data the power to control and manage their data. What should be observed by the Brazilian government in relation to data sharing is the construction of an interoperability mechanism within the public administration that is more attentive to the protection of personal data. It should also take into account citizens' privacy in order to assist, transform, and modernize the Brazilian government in offering public policies and essential service to citizens with greater quality, accessibility, and simplicity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juliana, for this very comprehensive overview of the Brazilian legal framework. I would also like to thank you because you were part of the organization team throughout this whole time. I would like to open the floor for questions. If someone has any questions regarding to data protection in Brazil or the open data, please raise your hand and introduce yourself. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering whether Brazil has any regulation related to automated decision-making systems. And that's it. Thank you.
Yes, we do under Article 20 of the LGPD. Article 20 of the LGPD. There is the right to explanation and the right to reveal the decision that is made by machine automatically. There is also a bill running in this moment at our Brazilian National Congress regarding artificial intelligence. This is a soft law, so we won't have rules, specific rules about what you asked me, but we will have covered principles regarding AI in Brazil. But by now, we only have Article 20 under LGPD with the right to the subject, data subject, the right to review, and the right to explanation.
Any other question? Okay, now that we know what is the legal framework in Brazil, we would like to know what can be improved or what can be done to promote data sharing and open data. And this is how I welcome our next panelist, who is Nicolos Ingales. Nicolos Ingales is Professor of Information Law and Regulation at the Law School of the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, FGV, in Rio de Janeiro, where he heads the e-commerce research group. He is currently a UN consultant on digital markets for the Brazilian Competition Authority.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolina, and many thanks to the organizer, Mackenzie and PI, for inviting me to present a view on the topic. I don't know if I will offer all the answers to the questions that you posed. First of all, we have the challenge of opening this presentation that is taking apparently some time. But I'm happy also to go after Juliana, because she already touched upon many of the issues. So I think this will allow me to speed through the presentation if it opens. Oh, finally. Very good. So, in the context of climate change, and climate problems, the role of sharing data is quite important. Can be quite powerful. Here, there are some ways in which data sharing can help to address problems, and it's currently not being done. Why? And this is what you, I think, are asking with this workshop. I think that the main concerns are data privacy concerns and also competition law concerns, so to connect to what's coming next. Because sharing of information is also, can be considered an offense of competition law under certain circumstances. And for example, in Brazil, there are no guidelines addressing what constitutes sharing of information or sensitive information that would constitute a violation of the law. So here there's some examples. The first one, you see there's people who share data about the deforestation that is happening. So again, here, perhaps there are no big concerns under either data protection or competition law, but to the extent that it involves individuals, but then there might be some. The monitor of supply chain management, I think, is quite helpful if companies want to get together and show that they are meeting sustainability and SDGs objectives, and they want to show that their supply chain is being managed in a responsible manner. This data is data that reveals their operations, and so it can create competition problems, if they all get together and share this important information. There's also a lot of environmental crimes that are happening and that they're not always being repressed by the government. So it's important that people can share information that they have about this. And these crimes can involve also individuals. So again, we have a clash here. But I think the most interesting part that I think is most promising for what we're doing here is to develop some ways of incentivizing people to act in a sustainable and responsible manner. So you can do that either like it's done here, you probably can't read the text, but it's an app that allows people to share their routes to going to a certain destination and showing that they chose the most sustainable path. They get a credit, they get an emission saving credit, and then they can monetize it on the app to buy something else that is offered by partners. So this, of course, it involves sensitive data of the geolocation of people. There is also something similar that was proposed for the city of São Paulo in 2016 or 17, where they were planning to regulate the transportation, the ride-hailing companies, and saying that every car basically had a permit of emissions and for the next 2 months, and then when they exhausted their permit, the amount of miles that they traveled, they needed to pay a tax. And so for this program to work, then the proposal was abandoned, but the idea is you install a tracker in the cars of the drivers to see how many miles they do. And so that's the idea, because and they were imposing it on the operators that make money out of transportation. They were not imposing this on BlaBla cars and services that offer this for free. Unfortunately, it was abandoned. But so I think that we have a lot that can be offered in the Brazilian law to solve these problems right now. So this is just a quick glance to show that there are many sources also of international law that can be used as a hook to justify claims of access to data, especially when it comes to government data. One of those, the Article 27 of the UN Declaration, is linked to what Professor Drexel was suggesting of the benefit sharing. So, but the state has a lot of information that is valuable, and the community has a right to access and get some benefits out of this information. But importantly also in the environmental field, this was the first convention, the Aarhus Convention of 1998, that established a broad participatory right for citizens to get to know how the government was deciding over the environment. Now, in Brazil, the constitution already sets some important principles with regard to access to information. So it says that whenever there are individual interests involved, people can have a right to access, but also when a community has an interest, regardless of the individual, or if something is in the general interest. So this is what is used to as a pillar to establish the freedom of information law, the access to information law. Juliana already commented on the principle of publicity of the public administration. It's very important. And we also have another article that says that people have basically this right to access information that is valuable to them. Juliana also mentioned the Open Data, the Open Government Partnership that was launched in 2011. Brazil was one of the founding members. These are some of the principles, and I think very importantly, it's not just about putting the data out in a very rough format. You need to give as granular as possible data, complete, structured, so that it's machine readable, and needs to be license free. It cannot be free and then people have to pay a license to the copyright of such data in order to use it, and so on. So this gave birth basically just a couple of months after the Open Government Partnership to the Law of Access of Information here. Julian already talked eloquently about it, but just to point out that there is both an active transparency mandate and also passive. So passive meaning that people can request the government to open up the information, and they don't need to provide a justification for this claim. They need to be specific, but there is no need to justify why you're wanting to know some more information about the government. Of course, there are exceptions related to confidential information and personal data. But interestingly, the law is intended really to not allow these personal data and confidentiality claims to be used as a shield to hide crimes, against fundamental rights and bad conduct by public agents, and covering of historical facts of major relevance. So, again, this is the intention of the law being very broad. How it's managed, this intersection between open data and privacy, basically there is a need to establish consent in many cases, but in some cases, it is not. So, if, for example, when it's a case of statistics and scientific research, as long as it's done without identifying the individual, this can be granted. So the access can be granted without getting the consent from the individual concerned. Or also a very broad reason for the preponderant general public interest. So this also has to be balanced in a case-by-case basis. How do you manage concretely? I mean, the people from open data are already probably familiar with this matrix. So when you, on one side here on the vertical column, you have the extent to which people are identifiable, and on the other side you have the level of risk. So the more you go to the extremes, the more you are in a dangerous situations, and you need to only provide access to data within a secure enclave, where people cannot live with the data and they are subject to strict controls. Lower level is you just require submission of an application, and then you impose some terms and conditions about how they can use this data, and you have to evaluate this application to see if they fit within the conditions. And then you go, one step lower, it would be just asking for the consent of individuals in order to use such data. But now I think we are in a period of rebirth or reinvigoration of the open data framework in Brazil. As Joanna pointed out, in 2016, there was this big decree that established a national open data policy with a body that is required to monitor the existence, the use of open data by government agencies. So you see this image on the right side. And the government has a lot of portals where you can access open data. One of those, the last one at the bottom, is from IBAMA, so the environmental minister, and there's a lot of data there as well. Now, the newest addition has been in 2021, a law on digital government that follows this trend, international trend of government as a platform. So where basically the idea is that the government needs to provide information as complete, granular, and transparent as possible, but not only the public administration in a traditional sense, also the providers of public services. So the entity that have been contracted to provide public services, they have this obligation. And everybody can request an opening of something that they have not already put out in the digital form. Now, the latest change that has been proposed in 2021 is an API that the government needs to make available for people to get real-time access to this information, but they thought that the government would not do, so it's not obliged to do that to put this API. It's still being debated, it's a proposal, but what they thought is we will allow to charge non-governmental entities that want to get this data in real time, so that the government can recoup the investment of creating the API. But this also means that do not have the ability to pay. And so what they said as a compromise is those people will access to more out-of-date data. So they will not have the same quality of data. But of course, this creates a system of arbitrage where somebody that has the money to pay can get access and then resell this data to those who are interested for a lower price, but still make some money out of it. And at the same time, this data can involve personal information. So it is a honeypot that it can create that is quite problematic. I think that this law of 2021 also creates a very interesting opportunity because it says that the administration, needs to create interoperability framework, facilitate interoperability, but also create innovation laboratories where people can participate with the government and try to test and figure out better ways to provide public services and manage the data as well as other public assets. And so I think that this could be used as a springboard to create a regulatory sandbox where people can collaborate, and that's what I call data collaboratives, to offer better solutions using data. And so why are these a good solution, a good idea? Because they would raise awareness, they invite people to participate, they allow the entity. So in a regulatory sandbox, the regulator collaborates with the market players to provide the secure space where they can test the product and they give recommendations. So for example, they could say how to protect the personal data right, how to resolve challenges of interpretation of competition law in this context, and it allows to collect a lot of evidence on how to do things better. So I suggest that this could be used maybe relying on some of the existing case law of data protection and competition to provide some facilitated solution. And then you can distinguish between different type of situation, different types of data sharing formats, and each of which would have slightly different rules. Now, there's no time to go in detail into that. I have a paper, and I have a link in the last slide to the paper. You can read more about this. Now, the latest addition to all this package was already mentioned by Juliana, this proposal on artificial intelligence from just a few days ago, and they do have the concept of sandboxes. It's very rough. It's not. It says that basically, as long as there is some innovation, and some discontinuity plan, which means when you finish the sandbox, how do you continue the operation of that kind of activity? Then you are entitled to use this sandbox, but everything is still to be defined by the authority. So the authority has to define the procedures, the rules, can issue recommendations. So at this moment, I think we have a lot of leveraging points that we can use, but there is still a lot of clarity to be made. I think that the biggest opportunities are at the interface of this public and private context, and sandbox would allow to facilitate the market players' collaboration, but they need to be a little bit tightened up and to provide more predictability. And I think this is the role that we as researchers can also do, allow them to think better about this and provide solutions. So here is the slide with the links and the book, which is open access, and you can find it online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for the very enlightening presentation. I also find very interesting because already he presented some database initiatives that we are going to see in panel 3, 4, and 5. And of course, the topic of data collaboratives is very fascinating. So if someone has any question, please raise your hand, or we can ask afterwards. Okay, please, Jörg.
Yeah, just one question regarding the regulatory sandboxes. Is there any set procedure who will be the chosen companies actually that can be part of that, or no? Okay.
No, and even the authority, we don't know. So this proposal for regulation of artificial intelligence says that an authority needs to be established, and then this authority will have all these powers. But it's a proposal, we don't have the authority. On the other hand, also in the law of 2021, they say that this is a possibility to create innovation laboratories. But it's not clear who has to do it and what is the consequence if you don't do it. But again, it's leveraging points. So if you build a theory and you convince the public administration, because also we need to bear in mind that it does not apply only to the federal state, but you can go to a municipality and tell them, look, why don't we do this? And there's enormous potential. There's a lot of data for the municipality that can be used to manage traffic in a better way, etc. So it's just a matter of using the tools to empower ourselves.
Thanks a lot.
There is one question from Arul.
Thanks, Nicola, so for that very fascinating presentation. And I think my question is more in clarification character, and it goes to both Juliana as well as you. So I think from both of your presentations, I get the impression that the Open Government Data Movement is based on the Access to Information Act, right? Because both of them came in the same year. Am I right in my understanding that the roots of the open data principles are in the Access to Information Act? That's question one. The related question is the Access to Information Act finding its roots in the Constitution of Brazil, or is it having its roots in the draft instrument which you pointed?
Yeah, so I can take this unless you want to. Okay. Yes, so the Open Government Partnership was established in I think, September 2011, and in November 2011 we adopted the law on access to information here. I haven't done the research of which one was produced first, but they have a substantial overlap, but not all the principles of the Open Government Partnership are in the law on access to information. Now, the other thing that you said, the open data movement is not just a law of access to information. There's much more which is putting the data available and creating these interoperable formats. So the technical side, the more like technological aspect came later to implement some of the principles of the Open Government Partnership. But also there are 3 provisions in the Constitution that were used in the preamble of the law of access to information. There are those that I put out at the beginning that are quite important, yes. So it's all together.
Just to complement, under Brazilian Constitution, we had the habeas data right. It's written in our constitutional, and we don't have any specific rule as we do have in the Lei de Acesso à Informação, Information Access Act, but it's under general principles such as transparency, democracy, that this law was elaborated. And there are 2 difference. They are different. The open data governance, as Nicola mentioned, and the Lei de Acesso à Informação, Information Access Law Act.
If I may complement to that one, for the people who are not Brazilian or from Latin America and are following, the habeas data is this right to access and also correct any information that is held in a public database, which means not only held by the government, but also any database which is of public use. And this term is interpreted in a broad sense, I understand. So just an additional piece, an additional leverage point which I forgot, it's very important.
Thank you very much. So I think we are moving now to the next part of this panel, and I give the floor to Herman for competition law perspective.
Thank you. Yeah. So we divided the panel in these 2, let's say, focuses. The second one will be more oriented on whether competition policy, competition law, consumer protection, or market regulation has something to say with respect to how to leverage data economy for climate action. Why? Because data is mainly a creation, creation by private initiative, new business models, new technologies that we have been seeing in the last years, but also because one can, taking the words from one economist called Professor Stern, who in 2006, Sir Nicholas Stern, who in 2006 said that climate change is the greater market failure that in the history of humankind. So somehow both questions about data economy, and the question about climate change are connected essentially with the question about markets and the well-functioning of markets. And so because of the same, there is relevant to ask whether competition policy and law can do something, yes, no, to what extent, or we should look for different tools in this regard. So for this panel, this part of the panel, our first panelist is Professor Pfeiffer. Professor Pfeiffer is a professor at the University of Sao Paulo Law School. He's a guest professor at the School of Economics of the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo. He's a master's and doctorate from the University of Sao Paulo. And he's a former executive director of Procon Foundation of Sao Paulo, and also former member of the CADE, so the Administrative Council of Economic Defense or Competition Defense. So his research areas are e-commerce, competition law, consumer law, and more broader economic law. So thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, German. First of all, I would like to thank the invitation for be part of this panel and for be part of this seminar. I would like to ask Professor Vicente, and I would like to ask again the Max Planck Foundation and all the universities that are be part of this seminar. My presentation is not properly a complete change of subject, because I will talk about competition, but I will stress the data sharing and how data sharing could promote competition, and how data sharing could help the fight against climate change. I like to use this prisma because I like so much Pink Floyd, but besides that, it's very useful to show how data portability and data sharing has different perspectives. They could be used as a self-determination, enforcement. But they can have as well competition impact and regulatory impact, and this is very important for climate change. So I will stress three perspectives of the data sharing and data portability. The preview of data portability on the data protection legislation. In Brazil, you have, as Juliana and Nicolo said, the provisions concerning data portability in our law of data protection. But data sharing could be a competitive remedy and it's important to see how the competition authorities will analyze data sharing agreements, for instance, that with green deals, for example, because Europe has challenge with the green deals, and it could be a problem that competition authorities will face. And the data sharing has a regulatory perspective. It's very important because, for example, environmental agencies could introduce some open data on environmental problems, or maybe data sharing on to industries and farms. This different perspective could be mixed. They have their own perspective, but they could be mixed and used in a mixed sense. The first perspective is I call self-determinating this perspective, because the main agent, or the more important agent, is the owner of the personal data, is the host of personal data. We have data portability in Brazil General Data Protection Law that is very similar of European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. This kind of data portability increase data control power of the owner of the data. So the data subject is the real protagonist of this kind of provision. They increase their shows. I will not read the the GDPR or the LGPD, but they, for example, in Brazil we have the data portability. It depends on the regulation of our authority, so it's not we haven't any enforcement of this provision until now, because our authority haven't regulated it. But what's the possible environmental impact of this kind of regulation? For example, a consumer who wants to port their personal data to a platform that offers products or services with less environmental impact. So it's very important, because they could port all their data. For example, port their data provided by a platform, a conventional platform of that book hotels and house, for a platform specialized in environmental sustainable locations, for instance. Or share data between smart objects that are more sustainable, such as a conventional car by an electric car. So in this case, interoperability is a very, very, very important issue for data sharing and data portability. And the competitive perspective. Data portability is very important because they could be a lock-in attenuation. Data portability is a decrease in exchange costs, is expansion of the right of choice, and enabling interoperability of intelligent objects on the Internet of Things. But we can use, we can think in some things that are related with climate change. For example, a determination of compulsory sharing of a data as an antitrust remedy in a decision, in a merger control or a conduct. We have not this kind of decision in Brazil until now, but it could be a decision of a competition authority. In this sense, sharing of that data could benefit more sustainable platforms that challenge incumbent platforms. So we can have a platform that challenges the main platform with more sustainable a way to offer the products or service. And I know that my colleagues will highlight this point, but there are some challenges to competition authorities to face with environmental issues. It's a very, very controversial issue, but we can join data sharing and environmental perspective in this sense. And the last one is the regulatory perspective. The central focus is the fulfillment of regulatory objectives, but we can also think in an environmental agency that could make a regulation concerning open data or concerning, for instance, the data sharing between industries and farms, for instance. I will not talk about open data in Brazil because, or open banking because Juliana did it, but this is a kind of example that the data sharing or data portability could be used as an administrative tool. Yeah? So the environmental agency determining the sharing of data between industries or between rural producers to achieve more rigorous standards of environmental sustainability. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pfeiffer. Now I would like to ask if anyone has a question. Professor Pfeiffer? Okay.
Hi, Professor. My question concerns the point which you said about the portability and if which should it be considered or not an antitrust illicit. Well, the LGPD explicitly states that it is one right of the data subject, the portability. My question is, would, if we try to allocate the portability as a competition interest, cause some sort of trouble or problems between the competencies of the authorities, like between the ANPD and the CADE in Brazil? Because what I will be afraid is for an administrative processes, the parties may say to the ANPD that it is not a competition interest, and to the CADE that is not a competition. They should not be aiming or regulating the issue because it would be a data protection issue. I don't know if I made myself clear, but thank you.
So thank you, Luca, for your question. In this sense, as we discussed yesterday, it's very important to have collaboration between the different authorities. It's important for two main reasons. Number one, it's very important to join this legislation to have a strong enforcement of data protection rules and competition rules as well. And number two, to avoid that one agency make the task of the other agency, or there are double condemnation, for example, for a same conduct. But in this sense, I would say that answer your specific question concerning the competence of the agency of data protection and the competition authority in Brazil. I don't think that there are problems because, for instance, data portability. If one platform or one controller of data refuse to the data portability that owner of the data ask, the authority of data protection has the task to find this platform. But if the same platform refused all of the data portability that questions or refuse data portability to all of its customers, I think it could be a competition problem if this platform has market power, for example. If there is an incumbent platform that refuses to all of the data subject the data portability, I think it could be a competition problem as well, because it's not one requisition, but requisition of all its customers. And this is a competition problem because it could but because it's an obstacle to the competition of the others platforms.
I have a question more regarding additional information on Brazilian law. We have now heard that there are data portability rights under data protection, under the data protection law. We can use competition law in terms of refusal to grant access to data. I wonder whether in Brazil then maybe also consumer protection law may help. For example, French law before the implementation of the GDPR implemented a rule according to which the user of a connected device has a right to data portability as a consumer. It was part of the consumer code, consumer protection code, and it was abolished because it was considered to be to go too far, and it was limited to personal data. Right, so that was the conflict in this regard. Also regarding competition law, German law is quite interesting because when it comes to data lock-in, you may go a step further in the application and design of competition law. Germany has a tradition of also granting protection against economic dependence, where you can't prove that there is actually market dominance, but there is dependence, economic dependence on another party. And in the last revision of the German Competition Act, the legislator decided to explicitly clarify that also data dependency is a subcategory of that of the application of that rule, which can be very helpful because it's very flexible. It's like a general clause. You can apply it in whatever context, and it helps you enormously because in a data economy it might be very difficult to define markets and so on, and it's much more straightforward to actually argue that for doing your business you depend on access to data that is held by another party. And in Germany, we have a strong tradition of applying that rule in private litigation, right? You go to a court, and the court can help you. The court may even give you preliminary relief with an injunction and order data access. I wonder whether you have similar tools also in Brazilian.
So thank you so much for your question. It's a very important question because before we have a specific legislation of data protection, the courts use the Brazilian Code of Consumer Protection to protect the consumers against data violation. Because we have our legislation or a specific legislation
Thank you for your question and comment regarding France. I would like only to comment that a concern that is it's a market concern is regarding the systems compatibility or incompatibility. So when the refusal is for incompatibility systems regarding the company. So in my opinion, I think we will face audits to really prove if the refusal of the company it's really when using this ground incompatibility of systems, because it's not easy. The right to portability, it's clear, but to put it really to make it, it's not easy. And now we are seeing that Brazilian companies are discussing how to implement that, since, as Professor Robert mentioned, these will be regulated by the data protection authority in Brazil. So the right is under LGPD, but all the details, the regulation, is still to come up. And another concerning, in my opinion, is the piling on effect. Because, and as mentioned here, now we have CADE, the competition, the antitrust body control, the consumer body control that is called SENACON, Secretaria Nacional do Consumidor. We have the Data Protection Authority. So there are three big governmental bodies looking at that. So, and we are facing that with the casing law. So SENACON going to the case, CADE and ANPD. This is the so-called piling on effect. Everybody going over the ball, right? So we still trying to put each thing in each place, but we are facing this now. ANPD maybe next year will come up with this rule. Thank you.
So I think it's interesting. There are several, as you point out, there are several bodies that need to do something, but also there are several provisions in these laws that require that interoperability is facilitated. I think, you know, the basic registry that was mentioned by Juliana, that decree requires that somebody in the government facilitates an interoperable format. The authority, as mentioned by Professor Pfeiffer, needs to provide some guidelines on interoperability. And also the law that I mentioned from 2021 says that a mechanism for coordination on interoperability format needs to be established, but we haven't seen anything yet. And I want to also say the regulatory sandbox can be a solution because it involves different regulators. I mean, to the extent that it involves different regulators, then it can provide a safe space for companies to do things in a way that is compliant with the law.
And just to mention that the sandbox solution was a great solution in the Securities Commission, and under the central bank in Brazil. So,
no more questions? No? Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. The next panel is, well, maybe data and climate change has a key feature in common, which is that they don't recognize borders. Data basically is ubiquitous, and so it's very relevant also to understand the framework for data free data cross-border And on the other hand, when we think about climate change, we cannot really think about like what's happening in one country because the effects are cross-border as well. So exactly because of that, I mean, imagine we are focusing on the Amazon, and the Amazon is a region that I mean, I think there are 5 or 6 countries that has something that has jurisdiction on that region. So that means that, of course, that collaborative policies are relevant. And exactly because of that, we designed this panel, inviting also experts in the field of competition law that are from Latin America, but from other countries. So we have with us Juan David Gutierrez from Colombia and Felipe Razabal from Chile. So Juan David, if you want, you can be the next speaker. I will tell you a bit about Juan David. He is a professor in Universidad del Rosario, Colombia, an associate professor at the Faculty of International, Political, and Urban Studies at Universidad del Rosario, Colombia. He's also in charge of the Latin American chapter of the ASCOLA, which is the Academic Society for Competition Law. And he's a PhD in public policy from the School of Government at Oxford University, and also has an LLM in public policy from the same university. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start by thanking everyone who is involved in this event at Max Planck Institute, Mackenzie University. Thank you very much. To anyone who's taking time, please don't start the clock. I'm just saying hello. And I also wanted to tell you that today, as you can see, I'm going to speak about competition law and deforestation. But I just wanted to point out that in Colombia, there's a very recent case about a merger in the financial services sector in which interoperability and transfer data was used as a remedy by the antitrust agency. But I'm going to save that so that Max Planck invites me to the next workshop on data sharing. I'm not going to tell that story. So let me start by telling you about this paper that I worked with my colleague Sebastián Solarte. We were asking ourselves about the intersection between competition law objectives and objectives really related to environmental policy. And we thought, well, why don't we try to test these intersections with the biggest policy challenge of all in the environmental sector, and probably, and maybe the biggest policy challenge in the world today, that's deforestation, right? And climate change. And in Latin America, well, the problem is basically deforestation in the Amazon. And we thought if that problem can't be tackled by antitrust, then what problem could be tackled by antitrust from the environmental perspective? So we use deforestation as a way of testing this intersection. And I'll tell you quickly about what the research question is, our methodology, because this is a paper we're almost finished, although, of course, I'm very happy to hear your comments and critiques. And I'll tell you basically about our main findings. I only have about 13 minutes to finalize my presentation, so I'll probably pass through some slides very quickly, but I'll take time for the main findings. So our research question was whether and how national competition law and policies contribute to foster or hinder initiatives that aim at addressing deforestation in the Amazon. By the title of my presentation, you're probably thinking that probably we didn't find much contribution, positive contribution, but actually we're finding clues that maybe antitrust is getting in the way of deforestation initiatives, or to stop deforestation, actually. And what we did was a comparative case study of 5 countries who have active antitrust law enforcement plus part of the Amazon in their territory, which are Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And we wanted to see whether these countries had anything to tell us about this intersection between competition law and the environmental challenge. I'm not talking about this anymore because I think we've already heard about what the Amazon is important for the world. And perhaps this map will show you the extent of deforestation in the Amazon in the last 20 years, which is quite significant and accelerating. And also, probably it's important to mention that there are markets, specific markets that are driving demand for products that are sourced from the Amazon and which are associated with deforestation: timber, cattle raising, gold mining, soy plantations, and coca crops. So it's both legal and illegal markets that are driving this deforestation. And there's something very important related to data sharing and in general traceability, and it's the fact that these supply chains are not really transparent. And therefore, us consumers sometimes really don't know if the gold watch that is using Felipe Irarrazabal has illicit gold from the Amazon, or whether the beef that we just ate was sourced from the Amazon. Sometimes we don't know, and of course the supermarkets won't disclose that information if that's not mandatory. So there is a problem with traceability. And well, deforestation in these markets, or the markets associated with the deforestation better, have these specific characteristics that make things a bit messier. Why? Because at the upstream level we have great informality in the market, so there's very small producers, some of them doing illegal things like cutting down the forests. And of course, due to the places where they are acting, well, the state is probably not present, or maybe it's just a bit, let's say, complacent, that they are happy with what is going on, because there's also a political economy issue behind this, and it's that sometimes local politicians are part of the deal. But then as you go downstream in this market, things get a bit more formalized, and in the end you have huge companies, multinational companies, such as the ones that operate in Brazil that export beef at large scale. And they are export-oriented markets, which are actually quite not just formal, but they are probably a bit more happy to comply with the law, with like in comparison to the informal actors at the beginning of the supply chain. So now enters antitrust law, and well, we have in Latin America many antitrust law jurisdictions. I don't want to go very fastly through this, but the fact is that the enforcement of antitrust in Latin America is very heterogeneous. You see that in this example, for example, Brazil leads the number of cases filed in South America in the last 20 years, but then we have a huge amount of countries that have very little cases. For our case study, which includes Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, we have 3 countries that actually have some record enforcing antitrust, and then a couple of them that have little record doing it. I'm going to move faster because I have around 10 minutes, and I want to focus on the main findings of our research. So remember that in our research question, we were asking ourselves about both what contributes antitrust, how can it contribute to fighting deforestation, but also whether antitrust hinders these initiatives against deforestation. So unfortunately, when we saw competition enforcement as a sword for addressing environmental challenges, we did not find antitrust cases that directly we could conclude, yeah, this case shows how antitrust and competition and environmental policies are aligned. No, unfortunately, we didn't find them. We could hypothetically think that maybe if in general antitrust promotes productive efficiency, that may mean that less inputs are used in the processes, and maybe this is good because then less inputs, less sourcing from the Amazon, but this is just a hypothetical. Then another hypothetical is that many of these countries pledged that they were gonna create like new forests from scratch, or like reforest areas. So if there's public bids for that, well, maybe one could say, yeah, well, antitrust will help with deterring bid rigging, but this, again, just hypothetical. And we actually found opportunities where antitrust could have been used, but it wasn't. So we have this case in Brazil between two companies that produce palm oil, and they wanted to merge, and they presented themselves before CAGI, and there was a third party who submitted a request for blocking the merger, but mostly based on environmental reasons, because they said, look, these two companies have problems with how they source oil palm from the Amazon, and you, CAGI, should oppose it because this is bad for everyone, from the consumers and so forth. And the CAGI answered right away and said, look, this is out of my forum. Don't bring me these environmental arguments. If you want these arguments, take them to the environmental agency. I'm not for that. So that was not surprising. I mean, in general, we found that the antitrust agencies and antitrust officials were reluctant to engage in this sort of arguments. And we'll show you more examples about that. So when we think about the opposite story about whether there could be environmental justifications against antitrust enforcement, what did we found? We found that 2 of our 5 cases do have exemptions to antitrust law. So in theory, at least, certain horizontal agreements could be authorized, and that, of course, includes collaboration regarding environmental objectives. But then there's the other 3 countries do not have that flexibility. They just don't have exemptions. One could say, well, as it happened during COVID-19, maybe the authority could use enforcement discretion. No, maybe, but that's not the same as having an exemption. So we have these exemptions, but what did we found? That in the 2 countries that do have the exemptions, they have not been used really in practice. And this is not very surprising, because in other places, such as in Europe, there are other national laws, competition laws, that also have this type of exemption and have not been really used. But then we also found other cases in which the agency was faced with environmental arguments. So this is far away from the Amazon, but we thought it was worth bringing in because it has environmental, it's associated with the environment. So in Colombia, there was a case in which the water and sanitation company of Bogota, which is a public utility, was fined by the competition agency because they were basically and unilaterally stopping selling bulk water to companies that operated outside of Bogota. So they said, we don't want to sell more water to these small companies that distribute water in the outskirts of Bogota. And the mayor of Bogota defended this policy of the utility, saying, look, we have to protect the water in Bogota, and we cannot continue distributing water to other places. This is just not sustainable, and it goes against our climate change policies. But these arguments were not bought by the competition agency. Literally, if you see the excerpt from the decision, they said, look, again, very similar to what the CAGI said, don't bring me environmental arguments, I don't buy them, I'm not the environmental agency, go ahead. And they, as I said, fined the company and obliged them to continue selling bulk water outside of Bogota. So that shows how, that's an example of how the competition agencies are reluctant to buy these arguments to protect people or companies against potential antitrust offenses. But then there's an even more interesting cases for our presentation today, and it's the beef and soy moratoria that operates in Brazil. So in Brazil, the largest traders of beef and soy agreed not to source from the Amazon. Parenthesis, it's not entirely illegal to have to do cattle raising or to crop soy from the Amazon in Brazil. There's a part of your parcel that you can use for that purpose, and that's why it's not just doing something illegal, but it is coming from the Amazon. And why this agreement was emerged because in Europe there are very strict policies about the import of beef and soy. And basically the companies that trade beef and soy at the export level face the possibility of market closure. And actually it's getting tougher and tougher. Now there's regulations that have been passed in the European Union that makes this stricter. So, and this is basically, I mean, this could be understood from antitrust perspective, from an agreement to boycott certain suppliers that produce in the Amazon. And this is not just something hypothetical. Actually, unfortunately, yeah. So, in November 2019, the Soy Producers Association, APROSOYA, threatened the soy traders that they would file before the CAGI a claim arguing that there was an illegal horizontal agreement. In the end, this didn't come through. I tried to find more information, but it seems that didn't happen. And in part, probably didn't happen because the European stakeholders came again and said, look, you have to keep on, or better even, keep out of the Amazon, or we're not going to buy your stuff. So in the end, apparently, the political economy story ended up in favor of the agreements. But these self-authorization agreements do have some antitrust liabilities. It's just not hypothetical. There is some liabilities. So 1 minute to tell you my takeaways from our research, and it's that, yeah, maybe competition law, it's not an obstacle up to now. We don't have, for deforestation at least, we don't have a fine, we don't have a terrible story. But of course, the soybeans case is a cautionary tale about what could happen in the future. Officials are not eager to engage with environmental arguments. They want to stay within what competition law tells them to do. And second, there are very few significant antitrust cases, and this may be linked with the fact that the value chain is very special. So at the upstream level, as I told you, it's very informal. So if the companies don't care about environmental law, well, they won't care about competition law either. I mean, they don't, if they are not complying with any sort of law, why would they comply with competition law? Third, this shows the limitations, at least at the global south, of using competition law as an instrument for environmental purposes. And what would think, why should we rely on undertaking self-regulation? Someone earlier today said probably something about, well, why don't we leave the companies that know best? But do they know best? Are they going to persecute the public interest? Maybe not. Maybe regulation should be more interesting. Are we gonna solve the lack of transparency at the value chain with competition law? Maybe not. Maybe we need a regulation so that consumers know that they're eating beef from somewhere that it's not the Amazon. So at least in this case, we see that there's little room for competition law, and I would be very glad to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan David. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
You have a question?
Thank you very much, Juan David, for your presentation. I actually would like to connect this with the research question that we had, because we have this trade-off. On the one side, we want to promote growth in the global south and in Brazil, but on the other hand, we also want to promote sustainable development. And you say that competition is not a tool that could foster this, but with your co-author in the paper that you wrote, maybe did you envisage other types of solutions? You mentioned regulation on traceability and so on, but I was thinking maybe, okay, Latin American countries isolated cannot be strong, but maybe the Andean community, do you know if the Andean community is thinking about this, and maybe they could be something more powerful than just isolated Latin American countries?
Well, thank you very much for your question, Carolina. The Andean community has only one case in like 40 years, right? So I'm not expecting something from them right now, maybe in the future, not right now. I mean, part of what we were thinking was, well, what policy instruments are out there? So within competition law, we've seen now different examples that are worth considering. First, we have the exceptions, which we saw, for example, in the Austrian law, and in other, like the Spanish law has an exception for mergers that consider sustainability. So there are specific sustainability exceptions, and that could be something that could be interesting to think of. But also we would then raise our hands and say, look, but in practice, no one's using that. So second, regulatory sandboxes, but for environmental issues and competition law. So that's something that the Greek authority is trying right now. Probably that's also something interesting to see. So that's within the competition realm. But outside competition, I think it's of course, it's an issue of more transparency, and perhaps, at least I would be in favor of a regulation that mandated greater traceability of the supply chain, which is something that already occurs in other markets. Let's say, for example, the diamonds market. It's a market that is more regulated, like because of international treaties and so forth, but at the national level could be done as well. So I presented this this paper in Europe a few months ago, and I told them, look, are you aware that 10% of the global deforestation is driven by European consumption? And I asked them, should we just be thinking about how do we deal with our things here, or should we start also thinking about consumption in general, and especially from your side? Because, I mean, of course, the weakest link of deforestation in the Amazon are very poor people that live there and have nothing. So, and if they live there, probably they don't have access to health, education, or whatever. So I think we should ask ourselves, why are people living in such state? Thousands of people that are day and day chopping the woods but have a very low quality of life. What as a society have to answer? Is competition law going to answer that? Well, maybe not. Maybe we should start thinking about social policies that help these people have another type of life. I mean, we don't see deforestation as it's happening in the Amazon in developed countries. I mean, it happened at other time due to the industrial processes, but not as it is happening here, and it's more a social problem.
I can. Very interesting. I was thinking two things when you were talking. First, you are talking about this exemption in general, but it would be very different if we're talking about the merger. For example, now you point out the traceability supply chain, which is an issue of sharing information, so information exchange, and it's different from saying output restrictions. We don't source anything from there. So have you looked into that in the paper? Or I wonder how the situation, so if your conclusion is based on a diverse set of practices, or it's just a general concept about the law that it doesn't provide a specific general defense on exemptions for sustainability. The other point I was thinking about is maybe there is some leeway in the regulated conduct defense that in some jurisdictions can be interpreted a little bit more broadly than in the European Union. I think the European Union, it's mainly when you have no choice. We know from Deutsche Telekom, for example, when you have no choice but to do what the regulator told you, that then you can excuse that behavior saying, it was the regulator that said it. But if there is some margin of maneuver and you should, strive to achieve the principles of environmental protection, maybe you can claim that that is not, is not anti-competitive because you are implementing the regulation.
Nicola, well, thank you. I agree with you that I focused very much on collaboration agreements, horizontal collaboration agreements, and the story could be different in merger, even beyond enforcement, in advocacy. I mean, and I think that it is sensible, as you are suggesting, that one does not make like a huge claim without perhaps seeing the nuance that these different ways of enforcing competition law could interact with environmental policies. But I do have a major claim, not because of only because of this paper, but also because of another one that we published very recently about development and competition advocacy. And it's that public officials, at least in Latin America, are very reluctant to engage with arguments beyond what the competition law establishes explicitly as their objective, which almost always is some sort of consumer welfare or market efficiency, and maybe some laws mention innovation, but it's never close to environmental issues. And we concluded that after conducting some interviews to public officials from different countries of Latin America, in which they acknowledged that maybe in context they wouldn't just forsake that there would be other issues, regulatory issues and other regulatory objectives, but their mandate was to protect competition or protect efficiency. So they said, we allow other public bodies who have the right to balance different interests, to do the balancing. We offer them our perspective, competition perspective, and they should decide what to do. And I think that this also has from a democratic point of view, I think it may make sense, because competition agencies are not accountable to people who vote, to voters. They're not accountable. They're actually the opposite. They want to be technical and autonomous and so forth. And that's great. But then if you're technical and autonomous and you don't, and you're not accountable to voters, then, well, you shouldn't be balancing society's interests. That's probably for other regulators, or even to Congress, or to other public officials who are elected or who actually responded to the public, to their decisions. Okay, good.
Vikas, please.
Yeah, thank you, John. And thank you, Nicolo. You asked the question, like, it's not a question, perhaps it's a thought, it's the elephant in the room, which we have to address, perhaps. In developing country world, the problem is that, there are missing institutions, or the institutions are suboptimal. And if you put a lot on their platter, they will be overstretched. So perhaps in the context of developing countries, pushing or pulling the analytical framework of competition law in different directions, perhaps is not the right solution. Perhaps the right solution is to create new bodies, give them mandate, clear, limited mandate, give them the contours within which they can work. Like, look at the beef thing, right? If the ministry said that, look, there would be no raising of cattle in Amazonia, the matter would never have reached the court of, competition authority. So, and this is something which analytically and theoretically different from what Professor Roberto, Juliana, and they were discussing, that privacy and is an issue which can be seen and approached through three different standpoints: consumer protection, data protection, and competition law. So, and this is where I think we need to draw a distinction between global north and global south agencies, and keep the reality in mind when we make proposals.
I totally agree with you. And earlier Professor Drexel said maybe adaptation is a better way, and you mentioned explicitly taking into account the socio-economic environment, and I would add, and the institutional environment.
Yeah.
Which maybe is not included in the socio-economic bit. And when you mentioned the elephant in the room, I thought you were also going to say something that I think it's difficult to engage with, and it's the fact that it seems to me that putting aside dynamic efficiency, which is not always the case in antitrust cases, in some cases it is, but in most it's more about prices. Antitrust tends towards output growth, right? I mean, if it lower prices, more consumption. So more inputs, so more stress to whatever sources we're getting. So for me, there's another elephant in the room, and it's that, well, antitrust is pushing actually towards more consumption. And that means that's not good for the environment. I mean, and at Ascola conference this year, there was a panel in which there was a discussion about degrowth theory. And there was a lot of, I don't know, some people were not comfortable discussing that. But I thought, well, yeah, but if you, I mean, it kind of makes sense. I mean, if we really think that we're gonna reduce these carbon emissions and taking resources from places like the Amazon, well, maybe we have to start speaking about degrowth. Sorry.
Thank you. Please.
Just,
yeah,
just one last comment on that, picking up exactly on what you said. So couldn't we also be considering, so just think about what has just happened in New Zealand, no? They have passed a law that they are going to prohibit people born as of the 1st of January 2009 but to smoke for the whole life. And that will enter into force, I don't know exactly, in a couple of years. That has a direct repercussion in climate change. So when we think about the role of competition law and competition agencies and consumer protection and this reference to voters, democracy, I mean, aren't we stressing a bit too much certain institutions in putting them above, looking at the future, because this is very long thinking. We're not thinking about, I mean, the voters, for as you refer, we're not thinking about the voters that are of majority of age now. We're thinking about those that will be the voters in 10 to 20, so we're looking very long term. And so what you refer also to dynamic efficiency. So the question is there any way that beyond this hard law, no, that you can think of that, and not just degrowth, I will say, I mean, degrowth needs to come also with certain common sense. How can we use data sharing in that regard to profit from that and achieve, I mean, we're clear on the goal, but we're not clear at all on how to get that, no? Because we know that, well, mergers, we cannot, it's not so easy, unilateral conduct, this is exposed at the end of the day, so it's not going to help. We're talking about adaptation, deforestation. Those are natural, I mean, the environmental needs also long-term processes. You cannot just reforest a forest from one day to the next. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I was telling someone earlier that I teach public policy. So when I teach public policy, I tell my students that it's when you are going to tackle a problem, before inventing solutions, you first have to understand the problem, right? So make sure that you understand the problem before bringing these solutions. And at some other conference, I presented the paper and someone said something that stuck to me. And he said, look, I don't understand. Is deforestation the product of low competition? Because competition is about promoting competition. So is deforestation a problem about low competition? And he said, you know what? You're right. It's not about low competition. It's probably completely the opposite. There's a whole army of people and companies that are willing to break the law in order to have lower costs and sell low-cost beef, low-cost soy, whatever. Actually, it's, and I mean, there's this book by Ariel Esrahi and Stuckey about competition over dose, and I think maybe it's more about a competition over dose. So that's why, although I don't want to make sweeping generalizations, I'm not sure competition law is the best tool to solve this problem. As I said, this is a problem, and I think that it's okay that authorities like the European Commission think, oh, we need to find all the tools to tackle climate change. That's great, but we have to think about what's more or less effective, and maybe there are more effective tools.
I completely agree. I think we have to differentiate between different problems. So the problem with the Amazon is an issue of negative externalities. So consumption actually, I would not say that it is competition, it is the free market. So consumption actually leads to negative externalities, and it destroys the Amazon and affects public interest globally, right? That's one aspect. And we should distinguish it from the role of competition law to provide consumers with low prices. And the matter is more what is a luxury product and what is not a luxury product. So I think we need other mechanisms that actually work in the sense of reintegrating the negative externalities into the price mechanism. But that is another field of the law. It should not be competition law. That would be my reaction to it.
Yeah, and I think we don't have time, but I just want to say something very quick. But despite of everything that I said, I find very interesting that competition agencies are willing to engage with other market failures, different than imperfect markets, like asymmetry for information, but they are not willing to engage with discussions on external negative externalities, such as the one caused by climate change. Like I found that interesting, that they are willing to step over other things like information asymmetry, but not over negative externalities. So there may be more about the political economy story that we're not saying right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An applause to Juan David. It shows that it's a very hot topic, a lot of questions, a lot of debate. So now we have the last presentation of the panel, Felipe Irarrázaval, who will give perspective from Chile. Felipe Irarrázaval is the director of Centro Competencia, who is a research center focused on competition and market regulation that has presence in Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and if maybe I'm missing another country. So he is also the former the former chief of the competition authority in Chile between 2010 and 2018. So and also professor of economic analysis of the law at the University of Chile. So he will give us a perspective that also somehow tries to add or adds an extra dimension to the debate, which is the data dimension. So thank you very much, Felipe. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And well, somehow I will continue with our previous reflection on how, as a competition agency or as competition law, we can interact with these issues. When I read the concept document that you made, I got a little nervous, and because competition in itself, it's so complex. I mean, in my professional life, I has been devoted for more than 20 years trying to understand competition law, and I have to say that I have not succeeded. So right now, I label myself as a humble competition lawyer. So in itself, it's so complex, and you have too many questions to resolve, too many tools, too many responsibility. I'm not talking as a former prosecutor, but also as a former practitioner for more than 12 years. But this, it's make it worse. So you have your own complexity, and now you are adding data, okay? So what happened? Well, you see that we have a problem, no? We have a challenge. Let's put it in a positive way. Yeah. We have the big tech companies. So when you see the Bundeskartell having a case like the Facebook, what you do is surprise and see and wait. What would happen to that case, especially when they are in front of a court, of a traditional court, challenging the decision from the agency. This looks awful for someone devoted to a practice of competition law, so sustainability. I mean, it's obviously it's a very nice goal. It's important, but looks very difficult trying to somehow connect it or make connections or take some kind of responsibility from the competition law perspective regarding sustainability. It's nice, obviously, but the question is, should we, I mean, as practitioner, as the academia, or as the agency, should take some responsibility regarding this? But this is a nightmare. And that was my first reaction. This is a nightmare. And when I wrote the concept note, I said, I mean, no way. I mean, this is going too far. I mean, it's interesting as an academia hypothesis, no, as a development. But when you are really, when you have blood on your hands, I mean, in terms that when you really have been working on specific cases, this is very, very difficult and could be a nightmare. But then you read, you know, businesses can use data tools to collaborate and optimize their decision making to achieve environmental goals. That sounds sweet. And if you are even, I mean, if you are a bureaucrat administrating the system, you really understand that there is a very profound reason why this is very important, not just for your country, for your region, but also for your world. And also, if you have kids, you can look at your kids and say, this is important. So what I would like to do in the rest of the minutes, I would like to transmit you how I think this important idea can be somehow, in a very shy way, connected with competition law, in terms that for at least competition law does not become an obstacle for someone to create those collaborations. At least that. Yeah, I'm not thinking about helping that, because that's it's too much for me. But at least not to become an obstacle. Well, and then you see Europe. But as Professor Gutierrez told us, we do have a much more strict framework in terms of what we can do on competition law. We don't have Article 11 of the treaty. It is true that reading that famous article of Ariel Spraki's Sponge, you know that competition law could be seen as a sponge. But for a bureaucrat, that could be a nightmare, because it means that you should be responsible for many results, for many social goals, okay? So if you really have tools for doing things, which is the case of antitrust authorities, you really are very aware and responsible on pressing the nuclear button on your faculties, okay? And you must be very careful on, be very precise on the policy you would like to make is strictly under the rectangle of the law. You see guidelines, Netherlands, UK, Europe, the horizontal guideline as well, which is interesting. And those efforts are very nice efforts. Try to somehow transmit to a practitioner, to the undertakings, I mean, how you would evaluate this relationship between sustainability, competition law, competition law and data. That's the nightmare. I mean, you know that you are under stress because it's like Harry Truman said. Harry Truman, which was a very simple but very intelligent president from the United States, said, come on, I need an economist, but a one-handed economist. I don't want someone said on one hand, on the other hand. I want someone just with one hand. And as competition expert, we understand and we have learned how to manage, to balance things, to make cost benefits, to put risk here, to put efficiency here, and to try to balance. What I think it would be very difficult to do is to have more than two hands, which is the case of I don't know the name of the god, the Indian god. So let me move now to challenge it for Latin America. Political and institutional instability. I don't want to go forward with that, okay? Check. Economy, concentrated, very traditional, brick and mortars. I mean, the Chilean agency has said many times that all the digital world is incipient in the case of Chile. Competition agency, lack of independence from the government. Revolving door. Understaffed. Not many people expert on, for example, data, because those are very expensive. Courts, lack of expertise. Formalistic view, limitation to precedents, which is something very important on this as well. And we have that on the continental system. And this is one of the reasons that we have to make and to be very delicate on how we construe the law, because judges will be, or they feel that they will be free to really understand that relationship and that enforcement and application of the law. Citizen, well, limited understanding on how free markets work. And that's something very tough because when prices go up, as he said, oh, what is happening here? All the companies are being under a collusion, and well, so it's not that easy if you are in the Congress or in a government position to try to explain to a public, to a citizen, how economics work really. However, this might be a miracle, competition agencies are trusted, and so far, I would say, had delivered very good results in the region. So here there is something that you have to protect, because what is very scarce in the region is trust. Trust between private sector and public sector. And if we do have that on on competition agency, well, you have to protect it. This is the way I can see the agency. It's not a sophisticated European car full of technology. We are not looking for that. We need a truck. And why? Well, because the roads are tough. And we will never drive at 200 kilometers per hour. Never. Because, they are not designed for that. Okay? So we need a truck, a reliable truck, like a Toyota. I'm not making publicity of this. And the problem, which is the same problem we are facing with the Indian God, it's we don't want that. We don't want an overloaded trunk. We just want the truck, but not overloaded. So it may be risky to entrust competition agency with novel goals, in my opinion. Ideally, agencies should be seen as technical, transplant, and take time to mature. It is important to have an administratable system. Predictable is of the essence, and the importance of regulation. A single mission framework of competition law can process environmental concerns and use data-based tools. Concepts such as consumer welfare, quality, dynamic efficiency, and innovation are flexible enough and very broad. Database tools can help to quantify and access. As I told you, in LATAM, digital markets are incipient, and to some extent, competition agencies are already doing this analysis. And I will show you on a specific 3 cases, and I will finish with this. For example, when the Chilean prosecutor in 2020 reviewed a merger, a joint venture between shipping maritime cargo, they were, I think it was nine companies, different companies, and they said, you are using blockchain. I understand that. Go ahead, even if it was risky. Somehow, and this is on the technological sphere, okay. And also, this is our incipient market. Then, probably you know this case. It's a joint venture, and this is interesting because it also makes some reference to sustainability. Different companies, including competitors, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, Siemens, BASF. And the Fiscalia approved that transaction in 30 days without any conditions. And look at the paragraph here. The exchanges of information may deal with matters related to compliance with certain environmental and socially responsible investment criteria, as well as the flow and quality of material, CO2 emissions in relation to a circular economy. So, they are flexible. They are saying, I believe you. I understand that you have very nice and interesting business intentions, So when you are balancing the risk, because the risks are obvious, you also have to evaluate the efficiency. And this is traditional competition law. And this is very interesting. It's a law which was passed in 2016. It is called Extended Producer Responsibility Act. And I understand that that's a very popular law in Europe. So producers of priority products, oil, lubricants, electronic equipment, packaging, tires, must take responsibility for the waste they generate. Okay? So it makes sense. They have to collaborate among them. So allows producers to participate jointly in non-profit organization called collective managed system. But they said that they have to fulfill with the competition law, and they created a mechanism. So they have to make a consultation vis-a-vis the antitrust court in order that the antitrust court said, I'm okay, I'm fine with this mechanism, go ahead, all together, even if you are competitors. And so far, 4 collective entities has been approved, and it is, I think, reasonable to expect that the development of database tools increases the opportunity to achieve better efficiency in terms of traceability, monitoring, and managing of the waste. But here you have a law. Because the most difficult part for the competition agency is collaboration among competitors, especially if you are under a per se infringement. So if you have that, but if you have a law, then you apply legal theory in terms that you have a special law authorizing the transaction, okay? So you don't have a problem, and you can see just the details on the issues. But probably this is where you can find the worst scenario for an antitrust authorities. And I will conclude with this. So climate change and the digital economy are 2 great challenges facing the world. Allowing and facilitating agreements for industry to be more sustainable through the use of data seems desirable. Theories are being developed to incorporate sustainability as a factor in competitive analysis. As long as these theories are not well established, in my opinion, Latin America should continue using traditional methods. In the face of substantive changes in the competition analysis, it is, in my opinion, desirable that they be reflected in changes to a law. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so maybe if there's one very, very short question, you, please, super short.
Just a very, very short comment on that, because I mean, you are pretty much tackling, I think, what our approach really is. And I think what is extremely important, and I think that's here really important also to see, is obviously you have this competition law angle and viewpoint, whereas I think it's enormously important to look at data law from a different perspective. So I do see that there are issues from this perspective of what are the issues if we talk about then the negative impact on competition, if we have data sharing agreements in that regard, of the joint ventures, the cases that you just mentioned. But what we try to do is really to look at it from a different angle and viewpoint, where data law is now a new form of economic regulation that not necessarily is in the realm of this traditional competition law. So I think that is extremely important, and just as a quick comment to maybe
maybe any other comment or question? Short? Very short, please.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try to be really, really short. The 2 talks remind me of the project we had at the Max Planck on competition law in developing countries, and we have very much debated on what should be the orientation and the goal of competition law. Should it focus only on efficiency and consumer welfare, or in the context of developing countries, should we stretch the goal? And I think the debate is still continuing in the framework of the data sharing economy, but I think also it's very important when taking into account the context of developing countries to see how far could we stretch the goal in the sense that meets the traditional goals of competition law. And here, if you take, for instance, the example of South Africa. South Africa has a competition law. I mean, it was very, very, very much debated on how far the goal should be taken into account. But they include this concept of public interest, which also go beyond efficiency and consumer welfare. But take into account public interest, the question is whether sustainability is a kind of public interest. And from an enforcement perspective, I totally understand the institutional framework has to be clear, to be reliable, and also do not give leeway also to an enforcement that is bad. And in South Africa, for instance, when talking about public interest, they have a very clear definition of public interest. What is considered public interest? It's defined in the law. So it's very important. I agree with you. You have to really have to clarify in the law what could be considered as sustainable. You have to define it. And from also a institutional perspective, not give the enforcement power only to the competition authorities. You have the competition authority has to make a case, but also it has could be challenged. And I think if we look at the case law in South Africa, it could brings ideas actually on how this concept of sustainability could be taken into account. But I agree that it's a great challenge. So Herman, it was very short.
Thank you. Felipe, if you would like to react.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you something personal. I suffer with these issues when I was the authority on something which is also very important, which is press and pluralism. And we did have a law that said that the fiscalia should take into account pluralism. That was a previous law. And I have to administrate that within also the competition law. So I have to apply two laws at the same time. And it was so difficult. Even, I mean, when you say pluralism, you say, wow, it shouldn't be that difficult. But it was, I mean, I felt like the Indian god, but confused. It was so difficult. And I mean, and then I said, I mean, why and how I should evaluate or weigh pluralism? What is the metric? How can I do that? You know. And fortunately, Congress changed the law, and then it just restrict the analysis on the impact on competition law, and then everything went smooth after that modification. At least in Chile, and that's the reality, most of the South American country, we don't have public interest ideas or exceptions or whatever. And I think it could be very, very difficult, especially from an authority which has not been democratically appointed. You know, I mean, as an authority, you feel and you see yourself as a doctor on a as I show you on an operation, openly the brain. I mean, and you don't want any bacteria. I mean, on the operation, and politics looks much more than a bacteria than the technical or 100% technical stuff. You know? And if you have that, and if you have different source of analysis of information, you really get confused. And if you get confused, you become unsecure of what you should be doing. And if you become unsecure, you are starting your political career. So you really have to be very responsible on what to do or not, or what not to do. But I will finish with this. But you are not silly as an authority. I mean, you know that life does not start and end in competition law, on consumer welfare, on efficiency. You know that. You know that life is much more complex. So you have to have more eyes when you are looking at the cases. You have to have maybe a little cynical on the specific reason when you make up your mind and take the decision. And if you have some beers with the authority, you realize that they know that, but they have to be very strict on the technical issue, and they cannot contradict principles like consumer welfare. I mean, they can try to help other principles, but without making or limiting somehow consumer welfare or efficiency. You know, but there are means for doing that. So you must be reasonable, flexible. You have to understand very well your law, and you can survive.
So thank you very much. So with this answer, we finish the panel. An applause, please, to everyone, all the participants. It was a really nice debate. And now we will have a break.
Yes, we have a 15 minutes break for coffee break. We will start a 5:15. And I'd like to apologize with the next speakers and the participants for our delay. So at 5:15 we will start the panel 4. Thank you. Panel 3, sorry, for tomorrow.